Washington, D.C., 1976. A retired Air Force colonel walks into a newspaper office carrying a manila folder. His hands shake, not from fear, but from rage. Inside that folder, organizational charts, names, dates, evidence, he claims, of a secret cabal operating above the president, above Congress, above the law itself. He calls it the Octagon. 8 tentacles, 8 power centers, one coordinated nightmare strangling American democracy in the dark. Within weeks, the colonel is discredited. His sources vanish. His documents dismissed as forgeries. But here's the question that haunts intelligence historians to this day. Was he silenced because he was crazy, or because he was right? Tonight, we descend into one of the most persistent conspiracy theories in modern history, a story where the line between paranoia and pattern recognition becomes razor thin. This is the Octagon conspiracy. To understand the Octagon, you must first understand the world that birthed it. The 1970s. America was hemorrhaging trust. Watergate had proven the president could lie. The Pentagon Papers revealed systematic deception about Vietnam. The Church Committee exposed the CIA's illegal surveillance programs, MKUltra, COINTELPRO, operations with names that sounded like bad spy fiction but were documented fact. Americans learned their government had experimented on citizens without consent, had overthrown democratically elected leaders, had turned surveillance apparatus on its own people. The social contract was shattered, and into that vacuum rushed questions. If they lied about this, what else? This wasn't mass hysteria. This was trauma response. Enter the figure at the center of our story, Fletcher Prouty. Prouty was no crank. 23 years in the Air Force, Chief of Special Operations for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He'd briefed presidents. He'd seen the machinery of covert power from the inside, and when he retired, he became convinced that what he'd witnessed wasn't democracy. It was theater. A performance staged by unseen directors he called the Secret Team. Prouty claimed this group, later popularized as the Octagon, consisted of 8 power centers: the CIA, military intelligence, major defense contractors, international banking cartels, multinational oil corporations, media conglomerates, academic think tanks, and elements within the executive branch itself. Not a conspiracy of individuals, Prouty argued, but a system, a self-perpetuating machine that manufactured consent, engineered conflicts, and profited from instability. The Octagon didn't need meetings. It didn't need a headquarters. It needed only aligned interests. 1972. Prouty begins writing. His manuscript details decades of alleged manipulation, how the CIA compartmentalized operations so thoroughly that even cabinet members didn't know what was happening. How defense contractors lobbied for conflicts to justify weapons sales. How financial institutions engineered debt dependency in developing nations. He describes a revolving door, military officers becoming defense executives, becoming government officials, becoming lobbyists, creating a class with no loyalty to nations, only to power. Prouty's central claim was explosive. The Octagon orchestrated American foreign policy to serve corporate interests, not democratic will. Vietnam? A profit engine for defense contractors. Coups in Latin America? Resource acquisition for multinational corporations. Middle East interventions? Oil. He wasn't claiming masterminds in a smoke-filled room. He was describing structural incentives, a system where doing immoral things was simply good business. But Prouty went further. He suggested this network had assets in media, not to censor directly, but to shape narratives, to make certain questions seem unreasonable, to define the boundaries of acceptable discourse. When his book, The Secret Team, was published in 1973, something strange happened. It sold well, then vanished. Prouty claimed entire print runs were bought and destroyed, that his publisher was pressured, that the book became impossible to find. Was this the Octagon silencing dissent? Or was it a failed publication exploited by a man desperate to validate his worldview? The truth, like everything in this story, depends on what you choose to believe. For decades, investigators have tried to verify Prouty's claims, and here's where it gets complicated. Some elements check out. Disturbingly well. The CIA's documented overthrows. Iran, 1953, Guatemala, 1954, Congo, 1960, Chile, 1973. All involved corporate interests, oil companies, fruit corporations, mining operations. Declassified documents confirm economic motivations alongside Cold War rhetoric. The military-industrial complex. President Eisenhower warned about it explicitly in his 1961 farewell address. The revolving door Prouty described? Verifiable. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara came from Ford Motor Company. Dick Cheney went from Defense Secretary to Halliburton CEO and back to Vice President. Operation Northwoods, a declassified 1962 Joint Chiefs proposal to stage false flag terrorist attacks on American soil to justify invading Cuba. Rejected by JFK. But it existed. It was written down. So the infrastructure for conspiracy, compartmentalized ops, economic incentives, proven deception, was real. But the Octagon as a coordinated entity? No evidence. Researchers found no communications, no membership lists, no budgets, no smoking gun. Journalist Edward Herman proposed an alternative in his work on propaganda models. You don't need conspiracy when interests align. Media serves power because it's owned by power. The Pentagon funds research because universities accept the money. Banks gain from instability because debt is profitable. The system produces conspiracy-like outcomes without conspirators. Prouty's critics argue he saw patterns because he wanted to. Confirmation bias dressed as investigation. But his defenders ask, if the system functions like a conspiracy, does it matter whether there's a boardroom? The debate reveals something profound. We lack language for systemic corruption that doesn't require villains. We need a cabal, a name, an octagon, because the alternative, that our institutions are structurally designed to serve power over people, is somehow more terrifying than conspiracy. Here's the twist that changes everything. Prouty was probably right and wrong. Let me explain. In 2013, Princeton University published a study analyzing 1,779 policy outcomes. They measured public preference against actual legislation. The conclusion: average citizens have near zero impact on public policy. Economic elites and business lobbying groups dominate outcomes. Not conspiracy. Peer-reviewed political science. In 2016, the Panama Papers exposed how global elites use offshore networks to avoid taxation and accountability. 11 million documents, journalists, world leaders, billionaires, a de facto coordination of interests without central planning. What Prouty described wasn't the Octagon. It was oligarchy, regulatory capture, plutocracy. The system doesn't need a secret handshake. It just needs people with similar class interests making decisions that benefit themselves. The genius of focusing on conspiracy is it distracts from the legal corruption happening in plain sight. Campaign finance, lobbying, revolving doors, corporate personhood. We hunt for shadow governments while the real power structure operates transparently, and we call it democracy. Prouty's error wasn't paranoia. It was giving the system too much credit for organization. The truth is messier, more bureaucratic, more banal, but no less destructive. So what do we learn from the Octagon? First, conspiracy theories are often distorted reflections of real power. When people believe in shadow governments, they're often detecting accurately that democracy isn't functioning as promised. They feel powerless because they are powerless. The error is attributing that powerlessness to secrecy rather than structure. Second, transparency doesn't equal accountability. The mechanisms that concentrate power today operate openly. We know super PACs exist. We know corporations write legislation. We know media is owned by billionaires. Knowing doesn't stop it. Third, language matters. When we call corruption lobbying and oligarchy meritocracy, we launder power. We make exploitation sound like process. Prouty's Octagon gave people vocabulary for something real, even if his specific formulation was fictional. Finally, skepticism must cut both ways. We should question conspiracy theories, but we should question official narratives with equal vigor. The same government that dismissed Prouty also ran COINTELPRO, lied about WMDs, conducted mass surveillance, denied until Snowden. Healthy societies require doubt, not cynicism, doubt. The willingness to ask, cui bono? Who benefits? Because power, whether coordinated or emergent, always leaves traces. The question isn't whether the Octagon exists, it's whether we have the courage to see the tentacles that do. Fletcher Prouty died in 2001, still convinced he'd exposed the truth. His book was reprinted by independent publishers. His interviews live on YouTube, dissected by millions. Some call him a prophet. Some call him a cautionary tale. Both miss the point. Prouty wasn't right about the Octagon, but he was right that something had hijacked the machinery of democracy. He just couldn't see it clearly through the smoke. We've spent tonight exploring a conspiracy that likely never existed, to understand the very real conspiracies hiding in plain sight. Because the darkest crimes aren't committed in shadows. They're committed in conference rooms, voted on in legislatures, and justified in press releases. And we call it business as usual. History remembers the crimes, but we analyze the truth.